She escaped the terror of her abusive husband, thinking she was finally free. But then, he showed up, armed with a gun, ready to destroy everything she fought to rebuild. What happens next will shock you. Stay tuned till the end to find out how far one man will go to keep control, and how far she'll go to survive. The room was silent. A heavy, unsettling stillness filled the air. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door. It was almost midnight. The only sound was the ticking of a clock. Her heart raced, thumping in her chest, echoing in her ears. The faint smell of old wood and stale air mixed with the lingering scent of fear. She could still feel his presence, even though he wasn't here. The abuse had been relentless. The bruises on her arms, the swollen lip, the terror in her eyes, all reminders of the life she was running from. She thought she was safe now. She thought she had escaped. Her body ached, but her mind was clearer than it had ever been. She was free. She had left him. But even freedom felt like a prison sometimes.
Suddenly, a sound.
A scrape at the door. Her breath caught in her throat. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The door creaked open slightly, just enough for her to see the shadow. Her stomach twisted into knots. Was it him?
No.
It couldn't be. She had locked the door. She had taken every precaution. Her hands trembled, and she slowly reached for her phone. But before she could dial, the door pushed open, wider this time. And there he stood. Her heart stopped. He was back. The man she had fled from, the one she feared more than anything, stood in the doorway. His eyes were cold, dark, like an endless void. She saw the glint of metal in his hand. A gun. The room seemed to shrink around her. The weight of it all pressed down, suffocating her. He stepped inside, slowly, methodically. The floor creaked under his heavy boots. She could hear his breathing, slow and deliberate. Her mouth went dry. Her chest felt tight, as if her lungs could no longer take in air. She wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. He grinned. It was a twisted, knowing smile. The same smile she had seen so many times before. Her hands shook as she clutched the blanket tighter. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. The gun was pointed directly at her. She could hear the faint click of the hammer being pulled back. Her pulse quickened. This was it. Her breath quickened, each exhale feeling like it could be her last. Everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. She could see the dark eyes watching her, his finger tightening on the trigger. She could hear her heartbeat, each thump echoing in her ears. The sound of the gunshot never came. The silence was deafening. Just the weight of the moment. And then, a sudden knock at the door. Her blood ran cold. Who was it? The knock echoed through the room. Louder this time. Her heart skipped a beat. She barely dared to breathe. He didn't move, didn't even blink. His grip on the gun tightened. The seconds felt like hours. Another knock. And then a voice. Police. Open up. Her body froze. Was it a trap? Was this just another one of his games? Her hands trembled as she looked at him. His face twisted in anger. The gun remained steady in his hand. But the knock came again, more urgent now. Police. We know you're in there. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Her mind raced. Could she trust them? Was there really anyone outside? The man in front of her stepped closer. The coldness in his eyes burned through her. He sneered. Don't even think about it. But the pounding at the door kept coming. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. A tear slid down her cheek. Her mind screamed for action, but her body was frozen. Then, the doorknob rattled. The police had a key. They had to. They had been following her. But what if? What if they were too late? She barely registered the sound of the door crashing open. In an instant, the room flooded with light. The police stormed in, shouting commands. Everything was a blur. She didn't see it coming. The gunshot rang out, sharp and deafening. She screamed. But it wasn't her. It was him. He had fired at the officers. Chaos erupted. Shouts, orders, confusion. The gunman was tackled to the ground. He fought back, but it was over. In the midst of the chaos, she collapsed to the floor. Her body shook violently. Her mind was numb. The officers quickly moved in, securing him. But she couldn't move. Her breath was shallow, each inhale coming with a sharp pain. She looked up, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw the faces of people who weren't trying to hurt her. The police surrounded her, offering their hands. But she couldn't grasp them yet. Her world was spinning. She had escaped. But at what cost? And was it really over? The world around her blurred. Her vision was clouded with tears, fear, and disbelief. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding in until now. The officers gently pulled her up, supporting her as she wavered. Her legs felt like jelly, like they would give out at any moment. The man was restrained now, dragged out of the room, his once steady grip on the gun gone. Her eyes followed him as he was hauled away, but it didn't feel real. The sound of his footsteps faded down the hall, but the weight of the moment still pressed down on her chest. "Are you okay?" one of the officers asked softly. She nodded, but the words felt stuck. She wanted to speak, to explain, to scream, but nothing came out. Her mouth was dry, her throat tight. They helped her out of the room, down the narrow hallway. Her body was still shaking, her hands clasped tightly around her stomach. She could hear the murmurs of the officers behind her, their voices a distant hum. The air felt too thick, too heavy. They took her outside, into the cold night air. The crisp chill stung her face, and she breathed in deeply, trying to steady herself. The bright lights of the police cars illuminated the dark street. She had made it, but she still felt like she was in a dream, a nightmare she couldn't wake from. An officer placed a blanket around her shoulders, but it didn't warm her. She felt numb, as if her body was no longer hers. Her eyes scanned the crowd of officers, the flashing lights, the cars, but it all felt distant, surreal. Everything was moving too fast. She heard the man's name, his charges, but none of it really reached her. She wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. She just stood there, staring at the ground, as if somehow it could ground her. And then, she heard something that made her blood run cold. A voice, far away but unmistakable. His voice. It came from behind the police cars. She turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. The man had somehow slipped free from his restraints. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening again. She could see his silhouette in the shadows. He was standing there, facing her. And in his hand, the gun gleamed under the streetlights. Time seemed to stretch, an agonizing moment of frozen terror. Her body screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. The world had become a blur of flashing red and blue lights. And then, the sound of a gunshot. The gunshot rang out, sharp and brutal. Everything seemed to freeze. A split second that felt like eternity. She didn't know if the sound came from him or from another officer. But the air crackled with the tension, thick and suffocating. Her heart pounded in her chest, her body jerking in response to the sound. Then the shouting. The officers were moving, shouting commands, closing in fast. She couldn't tear her eyes away from him. He stood motionless, the gun still in his hand. A blur of movement. Officers swarmed around him. She could barely comprehend it. Everything was happening too fast. The officer closest to her shouted something, urging her to move, to run. Her legs didn't listen. She was frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Then, the sight of him falling. The gun was no longer in his hand. He collapsed to the ground, his body crumpling like a rag doll. The world around her slowly came back into focus. The officers closed in on him, securing him once again. But the world felt distant. Her body shook, still rooted to the spot. She wanted to scream, but the words got caught in her throat. "Ma'am, are you okay?" One of the officers approached her, his voice gentle, his hand steady. She nodded but couldn't speak. Her legs finally gave out beneath her, and she sank to her knees. The cold concrete scraped against her skin as she collapsed, the adrenaline fading and leaving her exhausted. She could hear the sirens, the voices of the officers, the movement all around her. But it all felt distant, like she was watching someone else's nightmare unfold. The gun was gone. The man was gone. But the fear, the terror, still clung to her. It wouldn't let go. They gently helped her up, guiding her to an ambulance. Her hands were still trembling, her skin still crawling with the remnants of his touch, his presence. But he was gone now. He wasn't coming back. For the first time in years, she let herself breathe. But even as she sat there, surrounded by flashing lights and officers, the weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air. It wasn't over yet. She could still feel his presence in the back of her mind. A shadow that wouldn't fade so easily. The terror she had escaped might be gone for now. But deep down, she knew that the fear he had instilled in her would never fully leave. The ambulance doors closed with a heavy thud. She was inside now, but the world outside seemed so far away. The interior was sterile, harsh white light overhead. She sat on the edge of the stretcher, her legs dangling. Her hands were still trembling, her fingers gripping the fabric of her jacket as if it could anchor her. The paramedic beside her spoke, but her mind couldn't focus on the words. All she could hear was the steady beeping of the heart monitor, a reminder of the life she still clung to. Her thoughts were a whirlwind. The events of the night played over and over in her mind, like a broken record. The gun, the face of the man, the officers, the gunshot. Her hands clenched into fists, the nails digging into her palms. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" the paramedic asked again. She nodded, barely acknowledging the question. Her chest tightened, the air heavy in her lungs. It felt like she was drowning in the moment, struggling to make sense of it all. Her heart ached with the weight of everything. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the emotional scars that ran deeper. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see him, his cold, hateful eyes, his sneer. She could feel the fear creeping back, the panic rising in her chest. But she had survived. She was still here. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to breathe. The paramedic checked her vitals again, his hands gentle, his voice soft.
"Just take it easy," he said.
"We'll get you to safety." But safety felt like a distant concept now. Was she safe? Really safe? The sirens blared in the distance as the ambulance sped through the dark streets. Her mind drifted again, back to that moment in the room, back to the terror of seeing him standing there, gun in hand. She felt her throat tighten, a lump of panic rising. "He's gone," she whispered to herself, barely audible. But even as she said it, a wave of doubt crashed over her. What if it wasn't over? What if this was just the beginning? The ambulance pulled into the hospital, the flashing lights still bright against the dark night. But her world felt eerily quiet, almost too quiet. Her body was numb, but her mind was racing. The doors opened, and the paramedics rushed her out, their voices now a blur. She tried to steady herself, tried to take control, but everything fell out of her hands. She had escaped once. But would she ever truly be free? They pushed her into a sterile room, and the bright lights above felt suffocating. The fear never left. It lingered in her veins, a constant companion. She wanted to close her eyes, to pretend it was all over. But deep down, she knew that her battle was far from finished. She was alive. But was she ever truly going to be free? She lay on the hospital bed, her body still, but her mind a storm of questions. The constant beeping of machines was a reminder that she was here, alive, but not untouched. The soft rustling of nurses' shoes on the floor was the only sound that pierced the silence. Her thoughts were like a haze, swirling in the background of her consciousness. She couldn't help but replay the moments over and over again. The moment he stood in the doorway, the gun in his hand, the sound of the officers crashing in, the gunshot that never came from him. But what if it had been too late? What if the man still had a plan? A way to hurt her, even now, even after everything. She closed her eyes, but the memories were too vivid, too raw. Her fingers gripped the edge of the blanket, her nails digging into the fabric, as if trying to hold on to something real. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Her head jerked up, her breath catching. A nurse entered, a warm smile on her face, but there was something in her eyes. Concern, perhaps? "How are you feeling?" she asked softly, setting a tray of water and medication on the bedside table. She didn't respond immediately. Her mouth felt dry, and her throat was tight. "Still a little shaken," she whispered. "But I'll be fine." The nurse nodded, as if she understood, but there was a look of doubt in her eyes. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked gently. Her mind screamed at her to say no, to shut down, to pretend like everything was okay. But something shifted inside of her. She felt the words bubble up against her will. "He came back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The nurse moved closer, sitting at the edge of the bed. "Who came back, honey?" Her heart beat faster. The nurse's voice was calm, soothing, but it only made the memories more real. The man, her abuser, the one who had chased her across state lines, who had nearly killed her over and over. He had a gun," she said, her voice trembling. I thought it was over. But he came back." The nurse's face softened, her hand gently resting on the patient's. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said quietly. But the words didn't offer comfort. They only made the truth more real. He had come back. And in that moment, as the nurse sat with her, she realized that it wasn't just the gun that haunted her. It was the life she had left behind. The memories, the scars, the constant fear. And now, after everything, she knew that no matter how far she ran, those things would always be a part of her. The question wasn't if she would survive. The question was, how could she live with the aftermath? The nurse handed her a glass of water, her gentle touch offering a small measure of comfort. "Try to rest," the nurse said quietly. "You're safe here now." But she wasn't sure if she could ever feel safe again. The fear had burrowed deep, like an infection. It didn't just go away because she was surrounded by walls, by people who promised protection. Her body still ached from the years of abuse. Her mind was still haunted by his voice, his cold gaze. She could hear him in the back of her mind, even now, his words echoing. "You'll never escape me." And with that thought, a cold chill crept down her spine. He might have been gone, but the shadow of his presence would follow her forever. The room felt colder, the silence heavier. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. Even in the sterile confines of the hospital, she could still hear him, his voice like a distant whisper in her mind. His threat, his promise that she would never escape him. She closed her eyes, pressing her palms to her temples, trying to block it out. But it wouldn't go away. The nurse had left, but the door was still slightly ajar, as if the world outside was waiting for her to step back into it. She felt numb, like she was drifting, untethered. Her thoughts drifted back to the night. The crash of the door opening. The chaos. The gunshot. She didn't know how much time passed, but eventually the door opened again. A figure appeared in the doorway. Her heart leapt into her throat. She froze. Could it be him? But the figure stepped forward, revealing not him, but a new face. A detective, his eyes kind, his voice gentle as he spoke. "Ma'am, I'm Detective Harris. I know you've been through a lot, but I need to ask you a few questions." Her breath caught in her chest. More questions. More memories that threatened to drag her under. But she nodded anyway, her throat tight. The detective sat beside her, taking careful notes as he spoke.
I know it's hard, he said.
But we need to hear your story. For you, for others. Her mind was clouded, her thoughts scattered, but she tried to focus. She could hear his voice, feel the weight of his words. He was asking her for details, the specifics. The things she had buried deep. The things she didn't want to remember. But it was like pulling at a thread that had been knotted for years. Once it started to unravel, there was no stopping it. She told him about the first time he hit her. The first time she realized how deep his anger ran. She told him about the threats, the constant fear that haunted her every waking moment. About the lies, the manipulation, the control. And when she finally got to the part about escaping, her voice cracked. Her body trembled as she spoke. She had thought she was free. But now, in the stark light of the hospital room, she realized just how far she still had to go. Detective Harris nodded, his face grim but understanding. We'll make sure he never hurts you again, he said, but even his words couldn't reach her. His assurances felt hollow. What if he did come back? What if he found her again, this time with even more rage in his heart? I'm scared, she whispered, the words escaping her before she could stop them. He looked at her with sympathy, but something in his gaze shifted. Don't be, he said quietly. We're going to make sure you're safe. This is over. But was it? Her heart ached with doubt. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that it was truly over. But how could she? How could she ever forget what he had done to her? How could she ever let go of the terror that still clung to her, like a second skin? The detective stood, his hand resting on her shoulder for a brief moment before he left. But as the door clicked shut, she was left alone again. Alone with the echoes of her past, and the heavy, suffocating fear that would never quite leave her. The door clicked softly behind the detective, and silence settled in again, thick and oppressive. She sat there in the bed, feeling small, as if the world outside had forgotten about her. The sterile walls around her seemed to close in. The weight of the conversation hung heavy in the air. She wanted to believe the detective's promise, that it was over. But the truth was, she didn't know if she could trust anyone anymore. Not completely. Her mind replayed the moment of terror over and over again. The gun, his cold eyes, the way he had stepped toward her as if she were just a pawn in his game. The night had been a blur, but it had been real. Too real. And now, no matter how much she tried to push the thoughts away, they stayed with her, like an invisible hand gripping her chest. Her thoughts kept circling back to one single question. What if he wasn't really gone? She felt the throb of panic rise in her throat. What if there was no real escape from him? What if he always found a way back? She glanced out the window, the city lights distant but steady. She could almost imagine herself running into the night, away from all of this, into the unknown. But she knew it wouldn't help. She had done that before, and it had never been enough. Her body ached from the memory of running, from the constant tension of looking over her shoulder, from the fear that clung to every corner of her life. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. But it wasn't enough. The fear didn't leave. She could hear his voice in her mind, echoing like a cruel whisper. You'll never be free. Never. The words swirled around her like a haunting refrain. She could almost feel the weight of his presence in the room again, could almost smell his cologne, could almost hear the sound of his breath on the other side of the door. Was she just waiting for him to return? Her body trembled as she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, trying to shield herself from the cold. Cold that had seeped into her bones. But there was no warmth. Not from the blanket. Not from the walls. Not from the people who promised her safety. There was only the cold truth that she could never forget. He would always be there, lurking in the corners of her mind. He would always be the shadow that trailed her, no matter where she went, no matter how many doors she locked. But she wasn't sure how long she could keep running from it. How long she could keep pretending it wasn't there. The thoughts were too loud. The fear too sharp. And just as she was sinking deeper into the darkness of her mind, the sound of footsteps outside the room jolted her back to reality. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it him? Was he here? She sat up, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. The footsteps stopped just outside her door. She could hear the soft murmur of voices, but they were muffled, indistinct. Her pulse raced. A knock came, a soft tap at the door. For a moment, she didn't move. She couldn't move. The door opened slowly. And there, standing in the doorway, was another figure. A familiar face. The detective. But something in his eyes had changed. The look was no longer soft, no longer kind. It was hard.
Grim.
"Ma'am," he said, his voice steady but edged with something darker. "There's been a complication." Her stomach twisted. Complication? Before she could ask, the detective stepped forward, his face serious. "We've received word. Your ex-husband has been released." Her breath caught in her throat. She felt the room spinning, her world tilting on its axis.
No, it couldn't be.
"Not again." "What do you mean?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The detective's gaze met hers, and for a moment, she saw the cold truth in his eyes.
He's out on bail, ma'am.
"And he's coming for you?" Her heart stopped, her breath caught in her throat. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls pressing in like a vice. The detective's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "He's coming for you?" Her mind couldn't process it, couldn't grasp what he was saying.
No.
It couldn't be happening again. She had escaped. She had run so far, thought she was free. But here it was, the nightmare that wouldn't let go. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, her knuckles white as she gripped the sides of the bed. The detective stepped closer, his face hard, his voice low. "We've got officers out looking for him. But I need you to stay alert. Stay with us." She barely registered his words. Her mind was spinning, the terror returning in full force. What if he found me? Her stomach twisted, nausea rising as the fear crept back inside her, crawling under her skin like it had never left. What if he had always been out there, waiting for the moment when he could strike again? She felt the room closing in on her, her breath shallow. Too fast. No, he can't do this. Her voice cracked, the words breaking through the panic. The detective placed a hand on her shoulder, firm but gentle. "We'll protect you. We'll make sure he doesn't hurt you." But the fear wasn't in the hands of the police, wasn't in the officer's promises. It was in her mind, deep inside, a gnawing sense of dread that wouldn't let her go. She looked at the detective, trying to force herself to understand, to grasp the reality of what was happening. But it felt unreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Her hands shook as she ran them through her hair, trying to gather her thoughts. He had always been there, in the back of her mind, in every shadow, every corner. Every time she closed her eyes, he was there. But now it was real. Her mind raced. What could she do? Where could she go? How could she possibly stay safe when he was always just a step behind? The detective gave her a moment, but then spoke again, his voice low. "We have to move quickly. You need to leave here. We're taking you somewhere safe." Her eyes widened. "Where?" Her voice trembled. His gaze softened, just for a moment, before hardening again. "We have a safe house. It's secure. We'll make sure no one can find you there." Her heart pounded in her chest. A safe house? Would it really keep her safe? Her body felt heavy, like she was sinking into the bed. She wanted to close her eyes and pretend none of this was happening. But the terror was too real, too sharp. She felt the adrenaline start to course through her veins, her hands cold and clammy. "I can't go back," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I can't face him again. Not like this." The detective nodded, understanding in his eyes, but the hard edge to his voice didn't soften. "You don't have to face him. Not if we can get you out of here in time." She felt her chest tighten. Would it be enough? Could she leave everything behind again? Start over again? The fear threatened to swallow her whole, but she fought it back, forcing herself to focus. For the first time in what felt like forever, she forced herself to think, to survive. There was no choice now. She had to go. She had no other option. But even as she nodded, as she let the detective lead her out of the room, a part of her couldn't stop wondering, would this ever truly end? The world outside felt like a blur, the streets unfamiliar as they rushed her away. Her mind screamed with questions, with fear, with doubt. But the one thing she knew, the only thing that kept her moving forward, was that she couldn't stop running. Not yet. Not until she was finally free. The car sped down the dark streets, the lights flashing by in a blur, but she felt as if she were moving in slow motion. Her mind was racing, her thoughts tangled, but her body felt numb. The weight of the situation pressed on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had been here before, on the run, escaping, hiding. But now it felt different, more desperate, more final. She looked out the window, seeing nothing but darkness beyond the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, eyes wide, haunted. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but she couldn't quiet it. The fear still gripped her, twisting, turning. "Are you okay?" The detective's voice broke through her thoughts, soft but concerned. She didn't respond immediately. Her throat felt tight, as if the words couldn't escape. Instead, she simply nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The detective seemed to understand. He kept his attention on the road, but there was a heaviness in the air between them. They were headed to the safe house, somewhere out of the way, away from the life she had been forced to leave behind. But would it be enough? Her eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following them. A chilling thought crossed her mind. What if he's already watching? She pushed the thought away, tried to focus on the now. The detective gave her a sideways glance. "It'll be okay. We've got everything in place. No one will find you." His words were meant to reassure, but they didn't settle the knot in her stomach. What if he was wrong? What if she couldn't escape this, not now, not ever? The world outside the car felt so distant, as if she were a ghost, drifting between the past and the present. The only thing that anchored her to reality was the sound of the car engine, the hum of the tires against the pavement. Her hands were trembling again, but she tried to steady them, to hold onto some semblance of control. But the walls were closing in, and the shadows in her mind were only growing darker. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push away the images that flooded her thoughts. The gun. His face. The rage in his eyes. Her pulse quickened. It was like he was still here, still inside her head. "You'll never escape me." The words echoed again, louder this time, like an accusation. She felt a shiver run down her spine. Her breath came faster, shallower. She looked at the detective again, but this time, there was no comfort in his presence. What if he couldn't protect her? What if the safe house wasn't enough? There was nowhere she could hide. Nowhere that could truly keep her safe. The fear in her chest was suffocating, a heavy weight that threatened to crush her. She turned to the window again, staring out into the void. But this time, she didn't feel the isolation of being alone. This time, she felt something darker. He's out there. And no matter how far she ran, no matter where she went, she knew that the fear would always follow. The darkness. The gun. His voice. And no matter how much she tried to escape it, the truth was clear. She would never be free of him. Not entirely. Not ever. The road stretched on, endless, like the uncertainty that churned in her mind. She could feel the weight of the silence in the car, thick and oppressive. The detective's presence next to her felt distant, as if he were part of a world that wasn't her own. Outside, the city lights flickered in the distance like fading stars, but the darkness ahead seemed to swallow them whole. The car turned onto a smaller road, the asphalt winding and narrow. Her eyes darted to the rear-view mirror again. She couldn't help it. The fear twisted in her gut, a constant gnawing sensation. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her hands still trembling. She had to know.
Had to see.
Her gaze locked onto the mirror. For a moment, there was nothing. The road behind them was empty. But then, just as she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, a shadow passed through the reflection. Her pulse jumped. Her heart stuttered in her chest. Was it him? Her eyes widened, and she leaned forward, straining to see through the mirror. But the reflection was already gone. Was she imagining it? Detective, her voice was shaky, barely a whisper. He glanced over at her, his face tight with concern. What's wrong? I thought I saw something, she said, her voice trembling. He raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything at first. He focused back on the road, eyes scanning, but his face remained neutral. Do you want me to turn back? He asked, his voice calm, though his gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, checking for anything unusual. She shook her head, the words stuck in her throat. I don't want to go back. But what if I'm not safe here? She couldn't keep still. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands clutching the edge of the door. The shadows outside seemed to press in closer, as if they were stalking her. Her thoughts were racing, whirling with fear, doubt, and panic. She didn't know how much longer she could stay calm. What if she was wrong? What if it had just been a trick of the light? But she couldn't shake the sensation, the feeling that someone was behind them, just out of sight. Her thoughts kept coming back to that one moment, when she had seen the shadow. The fleeting glimpse in the rear-view mirror. Her stomach twisted. The detective suddenly slammed on the brakes, jolting her forward in her seat. Her heart leapt into her throat. What's going on? She gasped, her breath catching. The car had stopped in the middle of the road. The detective's hand hovered near his gun, his eyes scanning the surroundings. She froze, her pulse thundering in her ears. And then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of tires on gravel. Her heart plummeted into her stomach. They weren't alone. The car's headlights pierced the darkness, revealing a figure. A silhouette. It was moving toward them. She could feel the terror creeping up her spine again, gripping her chest. The detective didn't speak. He was focused, his jaw clenched tight as he slowly reached for the door handle. She could hear her own breath now. Too loud, too frantic. Was this it? Was this the moment she had been waiting for? The moment where the nightmare came crashing back? Her mind screamed at her to do something, but her body wouldn't respond. The detective's hand was already on the door, ready to act, but she wasn't sure she could stay still any longer. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but all she could do was stare. The figure stepped closer, the shadows making it impossible to see who it was.
Her throat went dry.
And then, finally, the person stepped into the beam of the headlights. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him, her ex-husband, standing there, just feet away from them. The nightmare had returned. The world seemed to freeze. Her ex-husband stood there, just beyond the reach of the headlights, his figure silhouetted against the night. The sight of him made her stomach churn. All the fear, all the terror she thought she had left behind came rushing back in a flood of cold sweat and shaking limbs. Her mind screamed for her to do something, but her body was frozen, caught in the vice of panic. He was still the same, dark eyes, that cruel smirk playing on his lips, as if he knew exactly what kind of effect he had on her. As if he was enjoying every second of her fear. Her heart pounded painfully in her chest. The detective moved fast, his hand gripping the door handle with a sense of urgency. But she couldn't tear her eyes away from him, the man who had once been everything to her, and yet, nothing at all. He stepped forward, closer now, his boots crunching on the gravel with each movement. The detective's voice was low, but firm. Get back in the car, ma'am. Her eyes flickered to him. She could see the tension in his body, his fingers brushing the gun holster. But it wasn't enough. Nothing felt like enough. The man who had tormented her for years was here, and she couldn't breathe. "Get out of the car, now," he called, his voice like ice, the anger and control clear in every word. She recoiled, but she couldn't move. Her mind was trapped in the past. The weight of everything he had done to her, the lies, the violence, it all rushed back with a vengeance. The detective didn't hesitate. He opened his door and stepped out, his hand on his weapon, his body blocking her view. Her ex-husband halted. A twisted smile flickered on his face. "You think you can stop me?" His voice was like gravel, sharp and mocking. But the detective didn't flinch. "Step away from the car."
Now.
She watched in a strange haze as the standoff unfolded. Her pulse raced, every second stretching like an eternity. Her ex-husband's eyes flicked to her briefly. His gaze was cold, calculating. And then in the next instant, something changed. Her ex-husband slowly raised his hands, his smirk gone, replaced by an unsettling calm. "I don't need to hurt her anymore," he said softly, his eyes still locked onto hers. The detective didn't lower his weapon. "What does that mean?" Her ex-husband took a slow step back, hands still raised. "It means I'm done." The words didn't make sense. They couldn't. After everything, why now? "Don't believe him," the detective said, his voice tense. "Stay in the car." She didn't know whether to feel relief or confusion. Part of her wanted to believe it was over, but her instincts told her otherwise. Her ex-husband turned and walked away without another word. No fight, no confrontation. He just left. The detective stood there for a moment, his eyes narrowed, watching the dark figure disappear into the night. "Get back in the car," he said again, this time more firmly. She nodded slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for the door handle. She wanted to ask why he left, what had just happened, but there were no answers, only silence. Her mind was a storm of questions, but her body was too exhausted to fight the fear anymore. All she knew was that the nightmare hadn't ended, not really. It had only shifted, and she was left holding onto the fragile hope that, for now, she was safe.
For now.
The car continued its journey, the road winding beneath the tires, but the world outside seemed quieter, emptier now. The detective drove with a steady calm, his attention focused, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air. Her ex-husband's sudden retreat felt almost too surreal, like a twisted game she couldn't understand. Was he truly gone? Or had he simply disappeared into the shadows, waiting for the next moment to strike? She glanced at the detective. His eyes were on the road, but there was an undeniable tension in his posture, a tension that mirrored her own. Her mind raced with questions, but they were all tangled in a fog of confusion and disbelief. She wanted to ask him what it all meant, why her ex-husband had walked away without a fight. But no words seemed to fit the vast emptiness that had settled in her chest. There were no guarantees anymore. She had learned that much. The detective turned a corner, and the safe house loomed ahead, a simple, quiet place tucked away from the world. It looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to think about the possibility of peace. A life without constant fear. A life without looking over her shoulder. But even as she thought it, she knew the truth. Peace was a fragile thing. And no matter how hard she tried to rebuild her life, there would always be scars. The past would always have a way of catching up with her. The detective pulled into the driveway, his headlights illuminating the small, unassuming house. She looked at the simple structure, a place where she could try to breathe again, try to rest. But she didn't know if rest was possible. Not for her. Not yet. She looked at the detective, and he met her gaze, his eyes offering a silent reassurance. "Get some sleep," he said quietly, as if reading her mind. "We'll keep an eye on things." She nodded, her throat tight, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel completely alone. She stepped out of the car, her legs shaky but determined. The night air was cool, the silence thick. The house stood before her, a new chapter waiting. But the road ahead, the one that led to healing, would not be an easy one. There was still so much to face, so much to rebuild. But maybe, just maybe, there was hope in the unknown. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself take a breath. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was running anymore. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning.